Hi, Congressman.
Hi, my love. Mutanyuela.
Yeah, Pila. Can I call you? I'm in a committee meeting and it's virtual. Sure.
Honorable members, good morning. I take this opportunity. Honorable Ngobile, did you mute? Okay. We are also welcoming the South Africans who may be following the proceedings of this portfolio committee through the various platforms that have been provided by Parliament to ensure that our people can access a real democracy as required by the Constitution of the Republic. Today, honorable members, we are going to be dealing with a matter that relates to some of the conflicts in the African continent, with specific focus today on Sudan. Lubabalo, do we have apologies?
Good morning, Chair and honorable members. We have two apologies. The first one is from Honorable Mishwa, and the second one is from Honorable Maimani. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Lubabalo. As you know, honorable members, I'm in Brazil. We are attending on behalf of the Parliament of the Republic of South Africa. We are a delegation of 4 honorable members, including those from the NCOP. We are attending on behalf of Parliament the 11th BRICS Parliamentary Forum. And one of the things we are looking at here is partly what we are going to be discussing here on how BRICS can play a role in dealing with some of the conflict situation around the world, particularly in the African continent. So today we are going to be having a presentation from Advocate Sipho Mantula. Advocate Sipho Mantula is a revolutionary Pan-Africanist. He's a scholar from here in South Africa. He is from the Thabo Mbeki African School of Leadership at UNISA. And we want to thank him for agreeing to come to make a presentation here today without any hesitation. He did that. And we are grateful of you agreeing to come here, Advocate, and we look forward to working with you as the Portfolio Committee to probe some of the geopolitical challenges we have in the context of us having to build a better Africa and a better world. So without wasting time, I'm going to give over to you, Advocate, to make a presentation. Honorable members, just in case I lose contact, so far it looks okay. Honorable Kumbacha, I'll ask that just in case I lose it, you can take over, but I'll still be here. Jambo Africa, Advocate Mantula, over to you.
Jambo Africa, Jambo, the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on International Relations and Cooperation, and honorable members Molweni, Dumelang, Busele. Thank you for this opportunity, a timely one. Just we came back from Africa Month. In May, we are in the month of June, a very important month also in our historical context that I'll be sharing this morning. And also to acknowledge that, Chairperson, it was not a mistake for this invitation in 2 fronts. The first one being that we are looking back at 20 years of the comprehensive peace agreement that was signed in Kenya about the conflict of North Sudan and South Sudan. And it happens that both former President Zuma and President Mbeki were part of it. Secondly, I was part of what I will call the separation of North Sudan and South Sudan in 2011 on a special mission by our government of South Africa. There were many parallel missions, we will recall, from liberation movements, but I was part of the civilian component. So I think it was very important to give that context. And the last one that I think it is important that maybe the committee was not aware. You have asked us to talk about Sudan, but if they can recall, the founding president of this country and the late Adv Sipho Mantula clandestinely visited Sudan in 1962 in June. So that's where some of the context I will touch on to say why it is very important for us this morning to just get into the history, but also get into the current developments. And if you can move to the slide a little bit to the content. And I mean, I've looked at the topic of the role of the para-diplomacy. And in this instance is parliamentary diplomacy here under the 7th South African Parliament, the Government of National Unity. And when I look at the role of the para-diplomacy, I look at what the state diplomacy, the military diplomacy has failed, the cultural diplomacy has failed. That's where the parliament becomes very critical. And if I can ask, if you move to the next slide, that we look at the content here. I think the context of the conflict is very important for the members of parliament to can grasp and grapple with this morning. And also understand the political situation and dynamics that are currently happening both in North Sudan and South Sudan. What I'll call the human security issues is what we'll call in the other language of state security language, but I opt to use the word human security. The humanitarian crisis is very important, and I think that's where members of parliament will be eager to say how can the South African government assist when there is a humanitarian crisis in Sudan, both Sudan, North and South. And finally, I will give recommendations and I will share the further readings with the secretary of the committee. And sharing the further readings with the secretary of the committee is for members to at least start to understand that Sudan has been deleted in the international media since 2023 when the conflict started. But let's look also what Kwesipra have said just in your back of the parliament in Cape Town, one of the elders who has written extensively on Sudan, that for us to understand the question of Sudan is that this ongoing conflict, it will call a question of our collective bona fide as Africans. And in these instances, as members of the parliament in South Africa and in Africa, we appear to do little to bring these conflicts to a halt. We hardly even talk about them. And hence this opportunity this morning, it will be important for us to start to talk about African conflicts and find a way of resolving them beyond this concept of international community, that they are the ones who resolve African conflicts. It's the same like the Sudan conflict, the same like the DRC conflict. They've been painted as they have been resolved by international community, as if Africa and South Africa is not part of the international community. For us to understand this context is that the conflict of Sudan began actually when Sudan got independence in 1956. We all know, members of parliament will always say Ghana was the first African country to gain independence in 1957, but we hardly forget Sudan, that it was 56, the 1st of January. But because of its politics of the Arab nation, will always gravitate towards Accra and Ghana. But the independence of Sudan in 1956 was the trigger of the conflict, but was also the trigger of the South Sudan. When Sudan got independence, the South Sudan was still in conflict. And this is a country that had many military coups. And if you look at this map, you look at Khartoum, you look at Umdurman, you look at the Port Sudan as a highly contested space here, but you also go to Wada Madani, which is also a highly contested space. But you might have left Darfur, but Darfur is what I'll call the sneeze of the conflict in Sudan. where we are finding ourselves, where we are with the two army generals. But the center around Khartoum is also historical. How Khartoum has been the battlefield for many years, centuries ago, not only from 1956, many years ago, Khartoum has been the battlefield. And that's how when we move to the next slide, I want us to look at if we move to the next slide, this map is very important, members, to always know that when you look at these areas that I have shown, the southern Kordofan, the Nuba Mountains, the RBA, and the RBA Commission will recall when former President Thabo Mbeki established a commission to look at the RBA with the then late Professor Guto, because this is a contested area where there are natural resources. But you can see it's close to South Sudan, and the Nuba Mountains and South Kordofan is close to Darfur. And that's where it sparked conflict also in Khartoum. The neighboring countries that you find here, your Libya, Chad, CAR, Ethiopia, we cannot rule them out. They are also impacted by this conflict. I will show it later on this current presentation, including some of the BRICS countries. Now, as I have alluded earlier, members of parliament, that the beginning of the conflict, the independence of Sudan in 1956, and the quest by South Sudan for its independence began the conflict in both sides. But the serious conflict started in 1956 until 1972, when it was mediated by the then founding father of the Organization of African Unity, Emperor Haile Selassie. That's what we call the Addis Ababa Peace Accord. That peace accord, it held from 72 until 1983. But 1983, it starts again with the introduction of Sharia law and President Nimer coming in. And that's where John Garang emerges also from the Sudan People's Liberation Army. And you will recall that why Sudan, it was both North and South, but it was still the North Sudan dominating the South. And John Garang pushed for this peace process that happened in 2005. Hence, I mentioned on my intro that it's almost 2 decades of the signing of the peace agreement of the South Sudan and the North Sudan. And it was in Kenya, Machakos. There is a Naivasha peace agreement. And both former President Thabo Mbeki and President Zuma were also instrumental. I want us to make sure that we don't give credit to the West only or to the international community without mentioning the role that was played by the South African government under the former president, both President Mbeki and Zuma. And that's what it led to the referendum that I've mentioned, that some of us were being part of that delegation or that observer mission to observe the referendum in the South Sudan. Now, when you look at the peace agreement, the late John Garang Dimabio of the South Sudan, he welcomed that peace agreement, but within 6 months, John Garang was assassinated. That's how sad it is. But also, as I mentioned, South Africa, I mentioned Kenya, I mentioned AU. We cannot say the peace agreement was through the troika of the US, United Kingdom, and Norway alone. There was the role of IGAD, there was the role of AU, there was the role of South Africa and Kenya. And that's how we can see, when we look at that, the peace agreement of the South Sudanese and the North Sudanese will have brought the new peace process, but it did not hold, because the peace agreement led to the referendum of 2011 that separated the North and the South. If you go to the next slide. Now, the context of this conflict is now being characterized, if we come now to the 21st century and we move out from the peace processes, there are many challenges. It's the complex power of politics between the two factions, whether in North Sudan or South Sudan. There's contestation for wealth. There's contestation for resources. There are issues of social inequalities in both Sudans, technologically underdeveloped. Despite that, there might be other military warfare coming into the conflict, but they are still challenged. Little infrastructure, if you went to South Sudan in 2011, there were not many hotels, but today there are many hotels. If you look at the challenge also of Sudan in the space of when you look at the role of international actors, hence I said to you, we have to also be mindful of the international actors who have played their role. But I've also added what I look at what are then the role of national parliaments in Africa and in Sudan. We might not look at the myriad or the hybridness of the role of international actors in the conflict of Sudan, which they've been relying on. Very important for us this morning to look at the role of our national parliaments in Africa. On the context also, I've looked at this concept that in 2018, with one of my colleagues at UNISA, we worked on this article, and I have to rephrase it this morning. We said from the hate to tolerance under the tree of your choice. What then is the South African parliamentary diplomacy and dispute resolution mechanism to end the conflicts in Africa, with specific focus on North and South Sudan? Our emphasis is that we must intervene in both countries because we have a political and economical and cultural historical connection to our struggles in the whole continent. And these are the two countries. Here I've mentioned DRC, you will apologize, MPs. We have two countries that have the longest rivers. That is the Nile River, which is Sudan. And I wanted to include the Congo Basin, why the DRC also has been the longest conflict. But as we are focusing on North and South Sudan, I thought that let's look at the Nile River, that it can also assist in the search for food and energy security in Africa. So that's how we should understand the context of this conflict, that there are socio-political and cultural connections. And due to the nature of the longest rivers they have, it also amounts to the longest wars and time that these countries have suffered for many years. Like I've said, South Sudan from 55 and North Sudan from 1956 when they got independence until today. If we move to another slide. Another important aspect that when we look now in the 21st century and Khartoum today, as I said earlier on the image, that Khartoum is a highly contested space. But look, when Khartoum was established in 1821, there was already conflicts because it was run by merchants and generals who just wanted to plunder Khartoum. And that's what we see today also in the conflict that we saw in Liberia and Somalia 30 years ago. And the ransack that we see in the Sudanese states today is 10 times bigger. If you look at that, when Khartoum was founded, there were two Niles, the White Nile, which is in Equatorial Africa, and the fast-flowing Blue Nile, which goes down to Ethiopia. And that's why even today you still have a conflict on the Nile between Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia. But that's how, when you look at Sudan also, why there is a war now, colleagues and members of parliament. You will recall Omar Bashir, and we'll maybe recall him how we will be blamed about allowing him to escape in South Africa, chairperson, but I think it was a calculable risk that we had to undertake to allow Bashir to live, because we had peacekeeping mission in Sudan during that time. But also there were pressing measures that we did emphasize. It was the AU soil. It was the jurisdiction of AU. We could not have arrested Bashir. But when you look at the rising of Bashir in the late 80s, in 1989, that's where you started to see the fragility of Sudan. The popular uprising of 2019 led by the women of Sudan, very important, the Nubian queens of Sudan. But that coup and that crisis of Sudan was also from the price of bread, the food insecurity that we saw in Sudan, that people were suffering, but most of their natural resources were being plundered and being taken to the West. Until today even, because the crisis of Sudan is that even if you are having this war, some of the natural resources are still flowing to the West, but people are hungry. Now here you see the emergence of two leaders now who are fighting at the moment. Al-Burhan and Hemedti staged a coup in 2021 against Omar al-Bashir. And Hemedti was part of Janjaweed, being part of the private military army of Bashir, and he was elevated to Rapid Support Force. So that's how you can see that Bashir created these two leaders also, Al-Burhan and Hamidid. And that's where when the war broke in 2023, in April, there was a power struggle between the two leaders. Despite that there have been many attempts to have a civilian-led government. We had Prime Minister Hamdok, who tried to remove Sudan from international sanctions. He tried to lead Sudan to civilian government, but nothing happened. And if we move to the next slide, that the war is actually created by those generals and the merchants that have happened in Sudan. If you can look, like I've said, your 1821 brings us to 2021 and also 2025, where we find ourselves. If you move to the next slide. These two opposing sides, now it's very important to know their power, their resources, what they have. You find that General Al-Burhan is commanding almost 300,000 Sudanese armed forces. Hamidid Dagalo, he's commanding almost 100,000. Well equipped and also being positioned across Darfur region now, as they have been dislocated from Khartoum and Umdurman. But also you see, like I said earlier, I think I've covered this, we'll go to the next slide, how RSF emerged. It was a Janjaweed rebel group that Omar Bashir, al-Bashir, was able to help them for them to assist him when he was having this challenge in 2018 and 2019. That's where this Popular Defense Force came about, the Rapid Support Forces. If you go to the next slide. These are the faces of the two generals. Al-Burhan is on my right hand, the one who's wearing khaki, and on black is General Al-Burhan is in black. Dagalo Hamidid is on the khaki one. And towards the end here is Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. These are the two names I'll mention later on my current presentation. Both Salva Kiir and Riek Machar were part of Sudan People's Liberation Army and the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. These are the faces that we need to always familiarize ourselves with, that these are what we call the instigators of conflict and also the power brokers of ending this conflict. If you go to the next slide. So we have talked about these two ones. The four leaders who are involved, or the two camps. We might not have touched on the Sudan People's Liberation Army factions that emerged after 2013 because there was a crisis. But in the current crisis in Sudan here, we find that there's also civil society in Sudan that is involved in trying to bring an end to a conflict. But there is also some of the groups that are also being colluding with the RSF, the Rapid Support Force, and some of the armed groups also loyal to the Sudanese armed forces. And that's where you find in 2023, immediately after the conflict, there was Sudanese coordination of civil democratic forces that was led by the former Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, who is representing what we'll call the people's voice, or the civilians in the peace processes. The Prime Minister has been trying by all means, but it has been difficult. I think moving from the context, I wanted to move quickly to our relations between North Sudan and South Sudan. Members of Parliament will pick up towards the end of this presentation about whatever we have raised, the context of the conflict now, what are the push and the pull factors? Why is this conflict not ending if it's going on its third year now, since 2023, and the one of South Sudan since 2013, and nothing has happened? I thought for us to talk about our historical relations, it was important to link the historical visit of Rolihlahla Mandela to Sudan in 1962. And his visit was very important because Nelson Mandela was actually going to the conference in Ethiopia of the Pan-African movement. But he happened to cross through Sudan. But it was not that he passed through Sudan only. There were young people of the African National Congress Youth League who were in Sudan for a training. So he had to engage with them. He stayed for almost 10 days in Khartoum. And that's where you find that the visit of Mandela was also inspired by what he has said before he even visited Sudan, about why are we not tapping into the Sudanese marine, or what we'll call the blue economy, the seaports of Sudan. Because Sudan has already committed that it will assist many liberation movements with training during that time. So it was important for us to know that Nelson Mandela visited Sudan in 1962. That's where our relations also begins as South Africa. If you move to the next slide, it's just now to show you the diary and the passport that was given to Nelson Mandela on the 19th of June, 1962. This is the passport that was given to Nelson Mandela. If you move to the next slide. Now, this is the diary of Nelson Mandela also that he shared when he was in Sudan, when they landed, who he met from Foreign Affairs, the hotel he was staying, the Nile Cottage Hotel, meeting with the Foreign Affairs Ministry, and also meeting with the then president of Sudan, General Aboud. And that's where the support was also strengthened by Sudan towards the African liberation struggles, or what we will call the struggles that were waged by the national liberation movements. I have mentioned this already, that he stayed for 10 days in Khartoum in June. He engaged also with ministries of sports, of foreign affairs, and the reason was that there were an ANC Youth League members who were part of the training program in Sudan during that time. You can move to the next slide. Now, as I said, Mandela spent those days there. It was important for him to engage with those young people in Sudan about political developments back at home. And it was just after Shavilanga massacre. Many things have happened. And then I think I've mentioned Dr. Muchubele Wesi Sekui, who was one of our diplomats, who was also part of those young people who were coming from Free State, from Bloemfontein, who were excited to meet with Nelson Mandela in person in 1962. If you go to the next slide. Now, the visit of Mandela to the former president, like I said, it also strengthened what the president of then Sudan, President Ibrahim Aboud, when he said that they are going to, they have pledged their support to the African people in their struggle for freedom. So Nelson Mandela, late president, emphasizing on that relation. Fast forward 1962 to the late 1960s and 1983 also, the ANC having relations with the South Sudan, with the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement also, where they shared common values in the struggle. And some of you will recall the late minister in the presidency, Collins Chaban, was also stationed in the South Sudan. So very important how the relation of the African National Congress and South Sudan dates back to those years, as the ANC was also looking at the Sudanese civil wars that were taking place both in North Sudan and South Sudan. If we move to the next slide. Now, these are very important historical aspects. Now, we are moving now to the cracks and the context. And I know I'm left with almost 30 minutes to 15 minutes, 15 to 30, I know. Now, the political situation and aspects of this conflict, members of parliament, I think is grounded on what the Minister of International Relations, Ronald Lamola, last week he was in Kampala, where he emphasized our commitment as South Africa. And I think that's where we can pull and pick up a cue there to say our MP is going to be committed now to the ongoing conflict in the South Sudan, that the conflict has an impact on civilians. It is affecting the critical infrastructure from your airports. We don't have the embassy in Sudan anymore as South Africa. Our economic dividends and investment have been affected in Sudan since this conflict. And Minister Lamola emphasizing about the importance of dialogue and conflict resolution here. And also how Sudan, North Sudan, must return to the African Union, as we know that the new chairperson of the AU has emphasized that they will want to engage with Sudan again. But also Minister Lamola emphasizing on the South Sudan, on how we should assist the South Sudan to rise above their differences and resolve their dispute through dialogue. as we know that this is the youngest state of South Sudan, born only in 2011, but 2013, there was a conflict that has also demonstrated the shaking ability or the absence of peace and unity. This was Minister Lamola that I thought I should give this political context of where we are today as we look at the meeting that was in Uganda, looking at peace and security and cooperation framework, not only for the DRC, but it included the two Sudanese. If you go to the next slide, still on political situation, because it is very important. It's very important as MPs to know that as we are dealing with information, intelligence reports are very important as MPs, that also we need to look at how do we coordinate as the portfolio committee with the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence also when we have to undertake any visit to Sudan or to DRC. The current crisis that we see now is that RSF, under the deputy commander, this is the younger brother of Hamedit, they are pushing now operations in the north and the River Nile states. You will recall that they've been pushed away from Khartoum with the Sudanese armed forces. Now, they are now threatening some of the operational facilities. We know about the Port Sudan also that has been affected since they've been pushed out of Khartoum. The second aspect that we also see is them trying to gather strength in Darfur, where they are trying to project again the issues in Darfur and at the same time affecting the humanitarian crisis that is in El Fasher. And that's how you see that the RSF is already threatening humanitarian access. You know, there is imposed blockade already in some of the areas. Now, if you move to the next slide on the political situation, that it's very important for the members of parliament to grapple with. Should they intend to make state visit, should they intend to engage with the Pan-African Parliament, how to deal with the crisis of Sudan. If you move to the next slide. Now, the political situation and the intelligence reports from the grounds tells us that both sides have been committing human rights violations, whether through extrajudicial killings, through torture or sexual violence, but there have been extrajudicial killings. The involvement of foreign missionaries, particularly from Colombia and the United Arab Emirates, despite that United Arab Emirates denied this at the International Criminal Court, the conflict is becoming now what we can call a regional and international conflict. And that's where some of the activists in Sudan, like Yasir Aman, have been calling for humanitarian access and the ceasefire from both sides. But there's been no engagement on this. And colleagues will remember that even last year, the Thabo Mbeki School and the foundation, we have tried to have the peace and security dialogue on the question of Sudan. Both RSF and the Sudanese army generals Malik Agar were present, but they never see eye to eye during that session. And I was present in that session. And our Deputy Minister of Defense, Bantolo Misa, was part of those sessions also. If you can move to the next slide. So it is important to also know that both sides, they are committing atrocities. Now, the crisis that we are seeing also is that the conflict, as I said, is causing major regional and international stability. We see refugees moving also to Chad and the South Sudan. And these are the countries that are also having shaky borders. Already in Chad, there are challenges of the Sahel in terms of the armed groups there. The South Sudan is having challenges also. The transfer of foreign fighters and weapons, the issue of cross-border insurgency coming in, the use of drones in these conflicts are also there. And like I said, the issue of the Sudanese army also developing relations with Iran is also bringing this conflict to the BRICS countries also that are involved. To say Iran is a member of the BRICS country, South Africa is a member of the BRICS country. It is important to know how are we going to engage on this. But as I said, some of these conflicts might also have the repercussions in terms of the international law. How do we sanction some of these mercenaries or foreign countries who are involved in the Sudan conflict? Those are the political situations that are very concerning in the crisis of Sudan. If you move to the next slide. Members of Parliament, I know you'll all be worried about this revitalized agreement of the peace process of Sudan of 2018. That is the elephant in the room. We cannot say that the peace agreement is still viable, still functioning. There are challenges, and it's also undermining the electoral process that has been postponed, I don't know how many times, more than two times in the South Sudan. And the issue of the arrest of Riek Machar early last month, it is worrying also. It has created a vacuum in the opposition leadership. But also the factions that are within Sudan People's Liberation Movement. If you look at Sudan, South Sudan, so members, as we have moved from North Sudan coming to the South Sudan, there are challenges that will also be a crisis. How do we restore this revitalized agreement that was signed in Addis Ababa in 2018? And colleagues, members of Parliament recall that Riek Machar was also at some point exiled in South Africa. He had to make a choice between Ethiopia and South Africa, and he opted to be here. If you go to the next slide. The institutional paralysis. And I think here the members of Parliament will say, but this is our area now. This is our turf. This is where para-diplomacy come in. The Transitional National Legislative Assembly of 2022 is not effective. It is paralyzed. And that's where we need to put strength in terms of the parliamentary oversight. You need the electoral management body to exist. The midwife of political power is not functioning. I think our ambassador in the South Sudan attempted to give them a vehicle early this year, but there's no appetite to go to the elections. But when I come back to the parliament, I think it is important that the members of this committee need to look at how to reconnect with the Transitional National Legislative Assembly of South Sudan. Not clear with the North Sudan because we have a new prime minister who has been sworn in, and he's trying to call his cabinet together. But what is important, it will be the members of parliament in North Sudan also to can engage with. The allegations that Salva Kiir is weaponizing the intelligence apparatus, suppressing dissent, and that's where others are saying he has even opted to bring his financial advisor, Benjamin Ball-Mel, to become his probably a successor when he leaves office, Salva Kiir. And that's where people are concerned about the rise of authoritarianism. If you move to the next slide. These are important issues, MPs, because that's where you find that the security situation of, you might have a peace agreement in 2018, but you still have ethnic violence and civil war that affects the other states in the South Sudan, the Upper Nile and the Unity states. And the issue of defection of SPLA, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, into different units, and how they have responded when Machar was arrested. Military fragmentation, it will always be there. And that's where we need to rein in the military and civilian relations in Sudan. Despite that, we have military fragmentation, but civilian and military relations are important to be maintained. Because here we are dealing with the human security issues here coming from politics. These are the issues that we need to understand, that they will always hold the security of the country. Once we have ethnic confrontation rise, it will threaten human security of South Sudan. If you move to the next slide on human security. The targeting of civilians and the targeting of humanitarian workers. It's happening in Malakal. And this also raises whether are there crimes against humanity that might guarantee the ICC or the ICJ to come in, or the African Court in Arusha to come in. It's still not clear, but there are killings that are happening that are targeting civilians in Malakal, that is in the South Sudan, and Doctors Without Borders. I've mentioned this before. It's also appearing on the human security data that the issues of external support coming from foreign countries also playing as proxies. They have an interest in the minerals and the oil of Sudan's. Both Sudans, they have natural resources. And that's where there's an appetite from neighboring countries and from European countries. If you can go to the next slide. The same transition, I mean, if we don't arrest the situation on human security, we'll find the vacuum that I mentioned of Kordofan, the Nuba Mountains, and Darfur, that now you have criminal syndicates that they see that there is no security in North Sudan. Now, transnational terrorist group emerges, and they are now using many methods, recruitment, arms trafficking, and illegal smuggling operations, and money laundering comes in there. And that's where we need to understand that Sudan now is going into what we call a regional unrest. Very difficult to have a counter-terrorism frameworks. And that's where members of parliament can emphasize on those aspects when it comes to the ministries of justice, how to strengthen issues of international counter-terrorism. The aspect on humanitarian crisis, I don't think we will leave it behind. It's very important, and I think that's where South Africa can still play a role. The members of parliament can activate many humanitarian bodies in South Africa to lend a help as part of our foreign policy of Ubuntu. The humanitarian situation is very catastrophic, colleagues, in terms of the data that comes from the ground. Malnutrition, health crisis, displacement in the Jongeli and Unity and Upper Nile. And when you talk of Jongeli and Unity and Upper Nile, that's the areas where John Garang was born. And that's how it is said that even founding fathers of the South Sudan, they are finding this war in South Sudan affecting them. Now you have many refugees also in the conflict in South Sudan and North Sudan. To go to the next slide on humanitarian crisis and response, food insecurity. And I said it earlier, you might have food insecurity, but others are benefiting out of the natural resources of Sudan. There's a certain plant that it comes out of Sudan that makes this Coca-Cola, but it's still going to the US, but people are suffering. 2.5 million people are on the brink of famine. Frequent blockade of routes. I've raised it that RSF is allegedly being involved. Health infrastructure has collapsed. Diseases like cholera, measles, and malaria increasing. And only 40% of health facilities are functional. And this is very worrying that even our own diplomats, when they face this challenge, have to come down back home to get medical assistance, because in South Sudan and in North Sudan, there is no medical facilities. So that's the crisis. But like I said, on food insecurity is also the issues of famine. That is also exacerbated climatic conditions of Sudan, but also the issues of blocking of the food aid that is being supplied by the United Nations. If you go to the next slide also on humanitarian crisis. Now, all this catastrophe that I've mentioned, El Fasher is one of the areas. There is a need in terms of military operation there. You cannot rely on the Red Cross only, despite that Ethiopia and South Africa has been punted as they are likely that they can assist there. But the issue is that on humanitarian zones, these airdrops, sometimes there doesn't show a sense of Ubuntu. Throwing a bag of mili to hungry people doesn't make sense in some instances. But also the issue of humanitarian air passage, it's also the challenge. The use of drones that I've mentioned also affects humanitarian crisis. Just recently in April, there was an international humanitarian crisis for Sudan in Paris. It's important how do we manage those funds that were raised in Paris, but when is the AU and Africa having its own international humanitarian crisis crowdfunding? Because we always push crowdfunding in Europe, and there is always corruption in those humanitarian funds that happens in Africa. To go to the next slide. Denial of humanitarian aid, I've mentioned it. And that's where I have raised the issue of that Both the UN and NGOs have been targeted by RSF. The issues around who controls the airspace becomes a challenge. The use of drones might also be created to assist to look at the potential targeted areas, but there is what we can say in short, humanitarian access is being denied in the South Sudan, also in the North Sudan, in where there are conflicts. So it's very important that we look at the issue of the responsibility to protect civilians. It also extends to the aid workers that are in Sudan and the NGOs. If you go to the next slide, just to show the numbers here of humanitarian crisis, unknown numbers. I always say that the conflict of Middle East is very important, but also the war in Sudan. You look at the numbers, how they are going up, both from Western Darfur, Central Darfur. We are talking of 10 to 15,000, but there are no estimated numbers. Others have said there are more than 20,000 actually when you look at the data. And you can see all these conflicts are happening within the area of El Jenin, both bordering North Kordofan and West Kordofan. You might see Khartoum being far, but it is also the trigger of all these conflicts. You might look at South Kordofan being far, but it is also affected. And all this death that have happened is based on the UN Security Council data. If you go to the next slide also, trying to zoom now on the numbers of migrants, immigration, people who are moving out of Sudan. If you go to the next slide. I think I will jump this slide because I've already indicated on the numbers. Now, this slide is of what we'll call IDPs, the internally displaced crisis that we see in Sudan. The internally displaced people in Sudan that has been caused by the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces. You cannot have almost 8.5 million people being displaced, 6.5 internally and others across the border. And you could see the numbers internally here. And when you look at Chad, the numbers are increasing. Egypt also, and Libya and Uganda, they are also increasing. But look at internal displacement that happen whenever there's a conflict in Khartoum. It pushes people all over the provinces of Sudan in many numbers. If we can move to the next slide. Now, as we move towards the end of the presentation, I have wanted to pose some recommendations, being optimistic that indeed we must have elections in Sudan in 2026. If they don't happen, as there's a legal term that heavens must fall. The free and fair elections in Sudan, they will need few things that we need to look at the challenges of repression, insecurity, opposition, fragmentation of Sudan People's Liberation Army, movement, SPLM that I've mentioned, the lack of electoral infrastructure, nothing has started. Like I've said, it's non-transitional. It's non-functional actually. And the issue of transitional constitution in limbo. So you can't have elections because there's no active parliament, there is no active electoral body, nothing has started. So you have a lack of electoral infrastructure. And I think the UN has been highlighting this challenge in Sudan, in the South Sudan. With Machar in prison, there is also contestation who will be a capable contester, a contester who will contest SPLM of Salva Kiir. So you have these opposition boycotts that might come in Sudan in 2026 as we are talking about the election that will happen. If you move to the next slide, you need the what you call civilian space, the mass democratic movements, the civil society. But the issue of the use of intelligence and the military and harassment of the journalists, political candidates might also be a negative factor. The impact of Riek Machar's absence or presence will always affect the peace architect of the Sudan, of the South Sudan. So it's very important that we look at this issue of how do we bring the political opposition members into the national dialogue in Sudan? Or at the same time, if you have a peace process, that is being planned by the AU, both in North and South Sudan, always bring the negative forces into the table rather than leaving them out, and at the same time you are having an escalation of this conflict. If we go to the next slide. On Riek Machar still, the issue of strategic importance here is that he's the unifying figure. He has been having confrontations with Salva Kiir many times, and they were pushed by that peace agreement of Addis Ababa to have 1+4, of having vice presidents that came from different oppositions of SPLM. But here's also the issue that worries. You might be looking at Machar and Salva Kiir, but there are many commanders within Machar's group of Nure who are worried also, and they are increasing. And these are the groups that are causing what we call organized insurgency in the South Sudan. So for the MPs, I will urge that to understand the military fragmentation and organized insurgency is how to deal with political egos and the political personalities of both Riek Machar and Salva Kiir. If we move to the next slide. Future scenarios. You know, I used to have friends from Ethiopia, from Mekelle, from Tigray. They used to love the second scenario, and I never agreed with them. The first scenario is that if you release Riek Machar, you could revive what we call the national dialogue, and you might bring cohesion within the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in opposition, but you might also provoke the backlashes from Salva Kiir loyalists. Now, the second scenario, like I said, some of my former intellectual laborers at UNISA who used to visit UNISA from Mekelle, from Ethiopia, they used to talk about this scenario of if Riek Machar or Salva Kiir dies, will it not bring peace in the Sudan, in the South Sudan? That his death or prolonged agitation, will it moderate the opposition? Will it leave unchecked militants and a full scale of war? So these are the scenarios that have been looked when you have leaders who have been into war for many years. If you move to the next slide. And what we see in South Sudan and North Sudan, I will repeat again, is what we can call existential crisis. It exists for many years, and it is renewing itself. From South Sudan 2013 to 2018 and to today. From North Sudan from 2019 to 2021 and to 2023, you find that this juncture even in 2025, if you look both Sudans, that actually just after 2010, you find after South Sudan separate from North Sudan, there's already crisis. And it leads to Bashir being removed in 2019, as I have mentioned. You might need also diplomatic intervention that has to be accelerated both politically and economically in the both Sudans and culturally. I'll always think that diplomacy doesn't come in twins, but it comes in tripartite. We need political and economical and cultural interventions in the crisis in Sudan. We need to look at if you release or replace Machar, will that not lead to cohesion within the Sudan People's Liberation Movement? The same like when you look at RSF and Sudan Armed Forces. If you bring Burhan and Dagalo into the same room and talk about military integration and the disarmament. We have to address the escalating military actions that are in the Upper Nile and the Unity State, because those are imminent crises that we find in this conflict in the South Sudan. If you go to the next slide. We need to bring back the African Union, the Pan-African Parliament, the intergovernmental process of the peace frameworks in Sudan. We might need to look at imposing targeted sanctions on the spoilers and human rights violators. I've never felt that sanctions works in Africa, but we need to find a way of how do we punish the human rights violators that I've mentioned earlier about both sides in the North Sudan and also in the South Sudan, because it is happening in both sides. We need to urgently establish conditions for humanitarian access and election infrastructure. And that's where I look at parliamentary diplomacy emphasizing electoral management cycle in Sudan to be rebooted in both North and South, because you need a governance in North Sudan, not a pro-military civilian governance. The same like South Sudan, you need to have a civilian government that comes in. If you move to the next slide, we're almost rounding. And I think history always is the best teacher. 21 years ago, the government of South Africa, the institute that I'm working for, and the SPLM, we had a tripartite MOU that was looking at supporting the South Sudan. And that was to build on what will have come in 2010, as I've said earlier, of training. Now, I feel that as Parliament, there's a need to emphasize on the leadership training, diplomacy, the support of public service, public finance management, of how they manage their natural resources, the rule of law, how do you emphasize the rule of law in legal affairs, security and policing, human security element, the intergovernmental relations within the state in both Sudans, the government communications, because once you don't have communications, then there is going to be lack of coordination. And the management of government information in this age of disinformation and misinformation. How do you manage government information with the advent of social media also? Very important as South Africa. How can we look at also the training of the members of parliament in Sudan to can fast track things that have delayed the change in both South and North? So I'm just rewinding members of parliament to say things have been, things were done previously and things can be done better even in the new government of national unity and in the 7th administration or the 7th parliament. If you go to the next slide. The next slide. I think no, you have jumped the last two slides. Now the last slide, not this one, yeah. This one, I'm also urging members of parliament that we have the mechanism. The deputy president, Paul Mashatile, was in South Sudan last year. He's engaging with the panel of the wise. So I'm saying here, parliamentary diplomacy meets with presidential diplomacy or state diplomacy. You can engage with him on the panel of the wise through our former deputy president, Mephumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, who is in the panel of the wise, that I will urge the members of parliament engage Mephumzile Ngcuka for a further engagement on these aspects, as she's been working on many peace agreements in Africa, from Ethiopia and Eritrea and Tigray, coming to the South Sudan, also briefing the deputy president. But I still feel that we have dropped the ball. As the envoy, I think there has to be constant engagement with the envoy and the members of parliament, as well as the public or public diplomacy element, to always inform ordinary South Africans what then is our role in South Sudan or in North Sudan. Because North Sudan, we don't have an envoy. We have not been strong in North Sudan post-2023 when the conflict erupted. So I still feel that the parliamentary diplomacy must also strengthen the North Sudan in terms of having an envoy and also constant engagement with the envoy in South Sudan. The last element, I think, on the presentation was now, the last slide was to look at, which I think it will suffice as I'm ending here, that the Speaker of Parliament in South Sudan, Meje Manu Nukumba, have emphasized on the role of African parliaments and parliamentary diplomacy, that it needs to engage and address what I will call also continental issues, whether climate issues or conflicts or issues of war-based resource or natural resources. African parliaments have to take that initiative, have to engage in different levels. Chairperson, I think I've tried to do justice to this, because dealing with North Sudan will have required an hour extra. South Sudan would have required an hour extra. I might have left important issues, but I don't think all it is lost, Chairperson, and to the members of Parliament. I still feel that there is a lot that we can do to rescue the people of Sudan, both the north and the south. And I think the role and the character of our former heads of state, it's still what I'll call an institutional memory. Both President Nelson Mandela, even if he's no more, but his text and his writings are still relevant. The presence of President Zuma and President Mbeki, President Motlanthe, and the sitting presidents in South Africa can also become what I call institutional reservoir of knowledge on Sudan and South Sudan. Enkosi siyathokoza siyabulela siyabonga rinolebua hakensa asante sana muntu obrigado zinkomo kwambili mejasota beseka ralebuga.
Spasiba, Jambo Africa. Advocate Sipho Mantula, re lebogile thata nkgonne. Thank you very much for that input. We will in future continue to request you to come and make such inputs on a more frequent basis going forward, because we need more time going forward. Just before we give members the opportunity to engage, just for yourself, Advocate Sipho Mantula, and members, as we are going to continue to deal with these issues in future, not just today. I think when we discuss these matters, we must continue to factor in the genesis, which is the 1844-45 Berlin Conference. Secondly, I think we must continue to feature in the importance of unity, not only of those states which are unstable, but the unity of the majority. Because my belief is that wherever we are in Africa, if you don't have the majority, the unity of the majority, before you have the unity of the nation state itself, there will be no stability in any country. The third one is when you respond, if you can indicate what's your view on the AU standby force, why is it not coming in to resolve some of the conflicts more forcefully? The possibility of an AU electoral body, so that there must be uniform approach, one institution for elections throughout the African continent. Whether that is possible, I think it is possible. The possibility of introducing, whilst you have states, alongside that identity of the population within Africa, introducing an Africa identity, which means it's an ID for the African continent alongside the existing IDs that we have and passports, so that you can use that as a possibility to have one integrated IT system where data will be consolidated, information will be consolidated, and that can help you to deal with some of the problems, which include, for instance, crime. If people from Mozambique come and commit crime here, they cross illegally and so on, you can't follow them up because they are not in our system electronically. So I'm just saying, when you respond, please indicate whether it's possible for us, alongside the existing identities of member states within the African continent, whether there can be an agreement within the AU that there must be, alongside, an additional identity where we will be able to capture everybody in one central database. And whether it's possible under the AU to have one minerals body and other natural resources through which everybody has to go. So that all these departments, for instance, in South Africa, you've got DMR and so on, you can have one umbrella body in Africa where everybody will have to go through, no matter where you come from, you have to abide by the rules of that body. The other matter relates to when we deal with these conflicts, we don't seem to be emphasizing the role that continues to be played clandestinely and through other sophisticated methods by the former colonizers. We want to bring people together in Sudan, for instance, but formally we don't have in place a process that says, let's look at the details of the role of the former colonizers, because they are indeed playing a major role in continuing to destabilize some of the states here in the African continent. And when you look at Europe, they don't have these instabilities. You will never cause these instabilities. They themselves are sending capital through NGOs, through private sector and so on, to cause the instabilities, and use pseudo companies also to cause instabilities, because instability cannot be sustained without funding. So I think we must, when you respond, also indicate the extent to which we can deal with neocolonialism. And whether it is possible in the African continent on strategic trade, instead of it being done through the private sector, whether you think it will be possible to have it done through state-owned entities, which means it will be state-to-state relation type of trade enterprises instead of the private sector. Because the private sector, because is driven by capitalism by and large, it's the one that buys people, that corrupts people throughout the African continent, and ultimately ends up ensuring that they set them up against one another. And then you'll have the spiraling conflicts in the African continent. The last point from my view will be what your view will be, because yes, we want democracy, right? So we have come to embrace the Western democratic value system as an accepted global norm. But where you've got situation like in the Sahel, where you've got an overthrowal of a neo-colonial system, whether you think in certain circumstances we must accept that that may be the only solution you are left with, because neo-colonialism is such that you will not be able to overcome its complexities, and therefore you'll continue to have instability, and you may only be left with that option, or the only option that you may be left with is a popular uprising by the masses, as long as both the masses, popular uprising, and the military coup will end up bringing in democracy thereafter. Because the opposite is a scenario. The opposite of thinking that you can survive through neocolonialism will continue to destabilize the country. And therefore, if you want some kind of semblance of permanent stability, you may need that radical intervention. It's just a scenario I will want to, when you respond, to look at. Lastly, I think I'm very, very happy that we have given a context to the matter, Sudan, and why South Africa could not effect an arrest on a head of state when they were here in Africa through the African Union in South Africa. I'm happy you have clarified that particular matter. And for those who have listened, I hope it settles the matter of al-Bashir, because wherever you meet, whether you're in Parliament, there will always be nuances related to the matter of al-Bashir, and I'm happy you have clarified it, and I'm sure members can probe further that particular matter. Members, it's now an opportunity to engage with the input by the advocate, by the advocate. Just take note, members, that I will have to, in the next hour or two, prepare myself to go to the conference. So at that point, I may request another member to take over the chairing of the meeting, or the committee will agree on who takes over the chairing of the meeting, because we have to go and have breakfast. I didn't sleep, can't sleep, and then prepare for the BRICS Parliamentary Forum. We will start with Honorable Wesley Douglas, followed by Honorable Mhlongo, followed by Honorable Powell, followed by Honorable Kumbacha, in that order. That's how the hands were raised. There's another hand that is coming up now, Honorable Zuma Sambuta. Sorry to pronounce your say name wrongly, my dearest sister. Yeah, those will be the hands that we have, honorable members. Honorable Wesley Douglas, Mhlongo, Powell, Kumbacha, and Zuma, in that order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to say good morning to all the colleagues and all our people that are online with us. And I want to thank you for opening the to thank Advocate Mantula for a very good assessment, and I appreciate the impact and what he's basically told us. But I must say this is very concerning for us as MK, and how this is being handled by the current government. You know, I am really shocked by the lack of caring for what's happening in Sudan and for our liberation struggle. Connections with Sudan has gone way back, as was actually put forward by the advocate. But right now it seems as if we are letting them down and we are becoming pacifists, and we're only starting to, you know, we've kind of left them in a place where there's mass genocide and there's mass starvation. I was watching the news this morning, Mr. Chair, and literally today there was the first convoy that went to Sudan of UN aid, a massive convoy of many trucks, and there was discussions and agreements on the ground between the two generals, between both parties, that there's going to be safe passage for this, because there are millions of people literally starving to death in Sudan. As you said, more than 20 million people have been displaced, but yet this convoy was attacked in broad daylight. It was destroyed. And this, Mr. Chair, shows that this isn't just a struggle, a regional conflict. This is a genocide against the people of Sudan, on both sides, from both sides, Mr. Chair. And I think this is where we believe that we have to be much, much stronger. This isn't just another conflict. It's a continental catastrophe unfolding in real time, Mr. Chair. And yet Africa and this parliament remains paralyzed by a sense of like quietness or silence. There's no strong leadership. There's no direction from South Africa. There's no diplomacy that is coming and saying, no, enough is enough. This must be stopped. Yes, there's you know, it's something that I feel we need to do something more about. You know, since the 15th of April 2023, the war between the SAF and RSF has killed thousands of people and displaced 20 million people and wiped out entire cities like Al Janina in Darfur. And yet there's barely a mention of these things. A whole city destroyed, many people killed. There's rape, there's murder, there's genocide. And yet we are not taking this seriously at the African Union. We're not taking this seriously at PAP. We as the South African government are not playing the role that we're supposed to play, especially having had this relationship with the Sudanese in the past. Where's our sense of urgency and where's our sense of outrage as a country? Because whether that's happening 1,000 kilometers from us or 5,000 kilometers from us, or whether it's 15 or 20,000 kilometers from us, it's happening in our continent. It's happening just up the road. And it's something that we should really step into, because this is not just an internal tribal dispute between two disaffected communities, Mr. Chair. This is a for minerals, for resources, for dominance. And there's huge Western interference at the forefront of this. And we mustn't mince our words in terms of how Africa has been exploited by many different parties, even internal parties, that is trying to take pieces of the resources that Sudan has, and the resources that that region has. And that's why there's so many people that are busy being involved. We have Egypt, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. They've all picked sides. They are arming and financing the RSF and SAF to protect the Red Sea trade routes and resource access. The United States is also circling the port of Sudan to look for trading, safety and security and military intervention for resource guarantees and resource beneficiation. So, Mr. Chair, this is right out to this playbook of the economic hitman, and it's something that's been going on in Africa for generations. This is just the modern version. Yes, we're using drones now instead of cannons and muskets, but it's the same colonization and the same proxy wars that is using Africans to fight Africans for resources, Mr. Chair. And for me, this is something that we have to come and do something about. DIRCO has to officially engage these partners. DIRCO has to officially come up with a proper strategy. I don't think that we have a proper strategy to deal with this conflict and conflicts like it. But I also think it's because our country itself, our government itself, our DIRCO itself is paralyzed by these austerity measures of the IMF and the World Bank, paralyzed by inefficiency, paralyzed by our own narrow perspective. We need to be able to look further than just our borders and say, yes, we need to free our people first from poverty, but we also need to understand that the conflicts like in DRC and Sudan have a direct impact and can come down further and impact us physically directly as well. If we do not do something about it, Mr. Chair, we're still very, very afraid to say anything, and African silence is equal to African complicity, Mr. Chair. The AU suspended Sudan in 2019, but what has it done since? What has it done? What has the AU done since that suspension? It does, as far as we know as MK, nothing has been done. There's no calling in. There's no massive interventions. The Jeddah Declaration has completely collapsed. Peace talks are just symbolic theater. It's not even real, Mr. Chair. And you see, we can't do anything because our SANDF has been hollowed out. Our SANDF, and I'm not saying that we must do anything. We should be working with the African Union peacekeeping force, and the standby force should be put in place so that we can make sure that there's peace on our continent. We need an African solution to African problems. Meanwhile, if we look at what's happened after the Jeddah Declaration collapsed and these peace talks had collapsed, we see the Janjaweed have returned. And there's genocide once again. And like we have seen with this, convoys of food, the first in over a year, which was meant to save the millions of lives, now is destroyed, burning. It's still smoldering right now as we speak, Mr. Chair, after that attack. So this is not just a political posturing. This is real. These people's lives are real. So, Mr. Chair, what is the African Union now doing about this, and is it still fit for purpose, Mr. Chair? Is the African Union really a peace-building body, or is it just a president's gentleman's club where people get together and they are too afraid to confront each other and have no teeth and have no heart for the poor? Is this just a place to do deals, the African Union now, or are we actually going to deal with African problems and real conflicts, or are we always going to say, oh, let the West come and help us? Because they come into places like now in DRC, the US is coming there with their military. And again, why have they gone in with the military? Because it's a peace and safety for resources deal, Mr. Chair. We can't have this kind of playbook played out for the rest of eternity as South Africans. And we need to stand up and we need to say peace and security must be done by Africans for African purposes, Mr. Chair. They were always telling us, and we are always being heard from someone that there's no military solution. But what is our diplomatic solution? What is our way forward? We appointed Deputy President Paul Mashatile to South Sudan, but in Sudan, where is there no...
Just hold on, Honorable Douglas.
No problem, sir.
Lubabalo, if we can get hold of Zianda, I don't know who is this Zianda. There's a Zianda Mhauli.
Noted, Chairperson.
Of that person, so because that person is not muted, she keeps on interrupting the speaker. Try and wrap up, Honorable Douglas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, like I said, our Deputy President Paul Mashatile was sent to South Sudan, but there's nothing in Sudan itself. And what is the interventions that's been made? When are we going as a committee going to get involved? So we need a Sudan emergency motion to be tabled in Parliament, calling for immediate AU investigation into foreign arms influence and inflows, humanitarian corridor deployment via SADC and DIRCO, and a travel ban on Sudanese generals until a ceasefire is reached, Mr. Chair. This committee must host a hearing with Sudanese diaspora in Cape Town and Pretoria. Let them speak and let us listen to what their stories are. A lot of them have fled fled their conflict zone and as refugees to South Africa. We must engage them as a committee, and we must understand it also, not just from a theoretical point of view, but from a real point of view. We must also demand DIRCO publicly clarify South Africa's stance on UAE and Egypt's role in this conflict. We must not be quiet anymore about this, that everybody understands who's who and who's funding what and how we're going to solve this, Mr. J. So Sudan is showing us who we are as Africa. We are allowing proxy wars. We are allowing other actors to come in without real solutions, Mr. Chair. So I want to leave it there and say thank you for the opportunity, but I do think that we need to do more. We need to choose justice. We need to have African dignity, and we need to have African solutions like the standby force, as well as humanitarian aid. Why are we not helping our people? Why are we not making sure those convoys get through? So, Mr. Chair, I'll just leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Honorable Datlas. Honorable Mhlongo.
Thank you, Chair. Greetings to yourself. It's still very early, I think, there in Brazil where you are. We hope you are well, Chair. Greetings to colleagues, and we must welcome the presentation that was done here today. Chair, my contribution will be, firstly, we are not doing justice, Chair, by analyzing the conflict in both Sudan and South Sudan if we do not recall the correct historical background on the Anglo-Egyptian condominium, which was administered by both the United Kingdom and Egypt. It was, if you recall, Chair, it was the British administrators that divided the country of Sudan into two distinct regions, which is North and South Sudan, which, honestly speaking, later then contributed to even the current conflicts that we see even today. Now, I'm happy that he began his presentation by mentioning that we discussed the crisis in Sudan and South Sudan just a few days after African Month. For us, chairs, the EFF, it's about time that African leaders critically examine the relevance of colonial borders in Africa and the purpose of maintaining them. Now, the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference, where Western powers petitioned Africa without a single African voice or even a mandate from any African state from Africa, has left long-lasting instability in Africa. The Sudan conflict is a result of the Berlin Conference. Britain's interest in Sudan must be contextualized within the larger scramble for Africa. For the wealthy and industrialized European powers, Africa offered them secondary markets for manufactured goods and a seemingly endless source of raw materials. The borders and the division of Sudan was never done for the prosperity of Africa and its children or to promote their development. The borders were imposed on us as Africa in order to divide and conquer Africa. And it was by design so that the colonizer may effectively extract our resources to build economies of Europe. Now, Chair, the economic, educational, and political benefits rendered upon the North compared to the neglect and expropriation inflicted upon the South in Sudan led to a vastly disproportionate balance of power in the independent Sudanese government. This power disparity was a direct cause of the Sudan civil war fought between 1956 and 2005. Now, we will recall that when South Sudan gained full independence in 2011, it entered statehood as one of the poorest, least developed nations in the world. The century of neglect under the British and violence and oppression under the North Sudanese left the fledgling country with an insecure future. South Africa, we believe that South Africa is strategically positioned to influence AU and facilitate mediation. We have experience in this regard of facilitating mediation, and our history in terms of reconciliation can be instrumental. We must foster peace. We propose that we must foster peace and integration of armed forces in both Sudan and South Sudan. South Africa can then train their armies and facilitate the increase of protection of civilians and humanitarian assistance. So that we save human lives. The number of Sudanese who have been displaced and killed, women and children who have been killed, ordinary civilians who have been killed, is too much for us as South Africa to continue to ignore it and to not want to get AU to be directly involved in that conflict. we have seen recently, or since the intervention of both AU and UN, have resulted into fruitless mediation. Nothing good has come out of their mediation so far. Perhaps it's about time as South Africa we step in and really enforce that there should be an urgent intervention in Sudan. The UN Security Council Chair has renewed the arms embargo, and we can facilitate a non-partisan mediation process at the center being African solidarity. The war, you will know, Chair, that the war in South Sudan and Sudan has evolved from just being mainly about ethnicity to now be an economic war. Now, you can't ignore the fact that in the regions in both Sudan and South Sudan, where it's naturally, where they are rich in the mineral resources, that's where the conflicts have escalated. Clearly, there's influence by external forces, and perhaps there's countries, we need to investigate if there's no countries that are fueling and funding these conflicts. More importantly, a country like the United Kingdom, because they are the ones who directly benefited from the colonization or the condominium that they had of the rule that they exerted in Sudan. And any attempt to a long-lasting stability in South Sudan must really derive from the bottom-up approach to state building. A pro forma return to pre-war status quo will only result in the continued outbreak of violence, as we have seen that there's continuous violence, because we still want to rely on how perhaps the solutions that were offered still resemble the status quo pre the wars, a status quo pre the independence of South Sudan. Anything that resembles colonization by the Anglo-Egyptian condominium is going to eventually lead to an outbreak, perpetual outbreak, and perpetual conflict and wars in Sudan. There will never be peace until they gain true independence and be able to hold elections, of which at this current juncture is not possible because there's no data and direct intervention from AU. Chair, we must always preach for African solutions to African problems. Perhaps we must fight for AU to have teeth that bite, AU to have more legislative powers, instead of AU being seen as a group of countries that just meet and speak things that they cannot implement, pronounce policies and issues that they've got no legislative authority to implement. So we must really fight for AU, Chair, South Africa, to have legislative authority over all African states so that we're able to correctly intervene where there's a crisis, because the war in Sudan or the conflict in Sudan can't be left out only to the people of Sudan, because clearly you can see that it has spilled over in that entire region, and now whether we like it or not, it directly affects South Africa and the entire African continent. So we must be able to clearly have AU that will correctly intervene, and we must call for meaningful and long-term peace, which must stem from a restorative justice approach to state building. You know, the theme of AU, Chair, for 2025 is to call for restorative justice for people of African descent. So it's what we must call for, Chair, in order to get things right in South Sudan. I'll leave it here for now, Chair. Thank you. Chair, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Honorable Misongo. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Honorable Powell.
Thanks, Chair. Chair, just on an administrative note, there's 16 portfolio committees that are currently being broadcast on the Parliament live stream channel. This is not one of them, which means that this is now, in fact, a closed meeting. So if we can just make sure that in future, when we do sit as People's Parliament, we do have the live stream on the Parliament channel, because we're not here to just talk amongst ourselves. We're here to represent our constituencies. If you could make an undertaking, please. And then, Chair, before I start with my contributions, perhaps when we come back to the advocates' responses, I'd also like it if you could respond in terms of potentially providing some kind of empirical evidence for your claim that Europe is sending NGOs to cause instabilities in this context? I think that's quite a sweeping claim. We, of course, know and acknowledge the devastating role that colonialism played and the injustice of what happened in terms of the dividing up of the African continent without African voices being represented. But to make these claims in the current context is fairly egregious for the chairperson of this committee. We know, of course, that there are paramilitary forces that are causing some destabilization in the Sahel, but your claim that European NGOs are being sent to cause instability, I think we need some empirical evidence. Advocate Mantula, with respect, I must say that calling South Africa's decision not to arrest Omar al-Bashir in 2015 when he visited Johannesburg for the AU summit a calculable risk in the context of peace processes isn't just legally flawed, but it's morally indefensible. Let's be clear. Al-Bashir wasn't a neutral party to any peace process. He was the architect of a genocide. Under his command, as you know, the Janjaweed militia unleashed terror across Darfur. Villages were burned to the ground. Women were systematically raped. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed and millions were displaced. And these weren't just collateral casualties of war, they were deliberate and targeted erasures of entire ethnic communities. And for this, Omar al-Bashir was indicted by the International Criminal Court on two different arrest warrants. The first, as you would recall, was in March 2009, where he was indicted for 5 counts of crimes against humanity, including extermination, torture, rape, and then he was indicted on 2 counts of war crimes for intentionally directing attacks at civilians. And then again, he was indicted on the second warrant in June 2010 on 3 counts of genocide related to attacks against ethnic groups in Darfur, including the Masalit and the Fur and the Zagawa ethnic minorities. So these ICC charges stem from his brutal counterinsurgency campaign, which began in 2003, and which all of us will concede, because there is evidence to this end, led directly to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, as well as the displacement of millions. So if we're going to talk about international law, international humanitarian law, South Africa's obligations, it's clear that we had very clear legal obligations, because in 2000, South Africa ratified the Rome Statute, and then in 2002, we domesticated the implementation of the Rome Statute of the ICC. So we have a domesticated implementation act, which means that as a state party, if we are upholding the law, we were legally obliged to arrest any person indicted by the ICC and to surrender them to the court in The Hague. So even though al-Bashir was a sitting head of state, which is often the feckless argument that is mounted, Article 27 of the Rome Statute explicitly removes impunity for heads of state in ICC proceedings. And our very own constitution, that we are also proud of, elevates international law to the point that it obliges our state to fulfill international agreements, especially those that have been domesticated. So the ICC Act gave domestic effect to South Africa's obligations, making the arrest of any person indicted by the International Criminal Court a domestic legal obligation, not a choice. And you will also further recall, with due respect, Advocate, that in June 2015, the Pretoria High Court issued an interim order which prevented Bashir from leaving until a decision was made. Our government, under the leadership of President Jacob Zuma, ignored this order and allowed Bashir to leave the country. And then a year later, in 2016, the SCA, the Supreme Court of Appeal, ruled that our state had acted unlawfully and had violated domestic and international law. Now, we're all allowed to have opinions, but when we have academic experts and specialists come and present to this committee, one would expect that they would uphold and embrace South Africa's legal obligations as being substantive legal commitments, not moral, ethical, or political choices that heads of state can make. And by having allowed Bashir to leave this country in 2015, we didn't just undermine international law, we actively shielded a perpetrator of genocide from justice. So this wasn't a calculable risk, with due respect, advocate. This was complicity in the current situation that we see in Sudan, because the Janjaweed didn't disappear. As you've explained, they evolved into the Rapid Support Forces, and today they are one of the primary drivers of this latest descent into civil war. These are the same men who rode camels in Darfur with guns and whips under Bashir, who are now terrorizing Khartoum and Darfur with drones and tanks. So the bloodline, you could say, of these atrocities remains unbroken, because accountability by African leaders for African leaders was never enforced. And the claim that we were told not to arrest Bashir or that we could perhaps ameliorate the failure to uphold law because Bashir was part of a fragile peace process. Well, where is that peace process now? It's in ashes. So in essence, our government failed the people of Sudan. And so today we're watching this catastrophe unfold. And so the DA, the party that I represent, we reject this idea that peace and justice are mutually exclusive. Because since 2015, South Africa has failed to show leadership in Sudan. And we failed to utilize the very African institutions that we claim to want to prioritize African solutions to African problems. I personally believe that justice is the foundation for sustainable peace, and international law cannot and must not be selectively applied. So if, as a committee, we're serious about championing African solutions to African conflicts, then what is it that this committee must resolve to call on our government and our leaders and our representatives at the AU and the SADC to do? My recommendations are that first, we champion the creation of an AU-Sudan hybrid tribunal that is given the legal powers to prosecute anyone who is responsible for war crimes in the current conflict. And if I'm not saying that we do, but let's say hypothetically, this committee as a collective opposes the ICC's jurisdiction in this particular matter, whilst leaning quite heavily on those same international bodies to persecute other matters, then let's build credible African alternatives through which we can administer justice. I would support the Honourable Douglas's suggestion that we support targeted AU sanctions against actors on both sides who are obstructing peace, who are committing atrocities, including, of course, ethnic cleansing, sexual violence, and the deliberate targeting of civilians. And we know that the AU Peace and Security Council has these tools. What's missing is the political will. Then I think that South Africa should revive its support for the African Court on Human and People's Rights. It's something I've spoken about frequently, to encourage Sudan to engage with this court, because we do currently have a few viable continental mechanisms for justice. We just don't use them. So this committee could push for a formal inquiry into violations committed and make referrals to that court. Then it's common cause that we need a new and inclusive peace process that isn't controlled just by these armed actors that are committing the atrocities, warlords in suits, but rather includes women and civil society. So I think that South Africa could be lobbying within the African Union and IGAD for a new mediation architecture that would put reform at the heart of negotiations. Then we have got to collectively insist, regardless of our differing political opinions, we have to collectively, as this committee, reassert South Africa's role in genuine continental peace building, not just empty platitudes. We've previously, as South Africa, played a critical role in mediation efforts in places like Burundi and in the DRC. But at this present juncture, very little is being done. So I would suggest that we make a recommendation that DIRCO establish a dedicated Sudan desk, and that Sudan desk provides this committee with quarterly updates on what South Africa is doing to build long-term peace in the region through sustained practical interventions, deploying Deputy President Paul Mashatile as a special envoy where he receives briefings as per the presentation. The president received a briefing from the panel of the wise. It's not enough. We have got to reassert our role on this continent as a leader. And then more broadly, Chairperson, and outside of just the context of Sudan, we need to clarify our relationship with international institutions of justice. So do we support the International Criminal Court? Do we support the International Court of Justice? Because whilst we're very effective in utilizing these mechanisms to prosecute and persecute in certain conflicts outside of the African continent, it seems that when there are indictments made on the continent, certainly the previous ANC-led government has been unwilling to enforce the consequences of these referrals and these indictments. So are we as a committee going to publicly reassert our commitment to these international bodies, or are we going to say, no, we prefer African alternatives, and then are we going to show leadership in actually developing these mechanisms? Because we can't come to this committee and it's just week after week the same rhetoric of, you know, neo-colonial imperialist tendencies destabilizing the continent. Yes, what happened in our history was abhorrent, but we have got to demonstrate leadership in this current context. And it's now high noon for us to stop preaching about peace, but at the same time protecting despots, dictators, and warlords under the auspices of sort of these being our fraternal allies in the struggle for liberation. It's intellectually deficient. It is intellectually dishonest. And I think that this committee has a real opportunity and we must use it. Yeah, those are my inputs for now. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Powell. Thank you very much. Honorable Kumbacha.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to yourself and all the honorable members present, and to Advocate Mantula and his team. Mine will be a bit brief, Chair. Firstly, I want to agree that, you know, with the recommendation that parliamentary diplomacy alongside the presidency is very necessary, because I think it also helps us and to strengthen our efforts, you know, in our peace and stability agenda. In addition, I think Parliament, from my side, can work. We need to ensure that there's institutional energy between ourselves and the presidency, and we need to ensure a united and consistent approach when they have these foreign engagements. So I think that's number one. And then secondly, you know, I think Parliament can also play a proactive role by providing oversight on the peace agreements and contributing to the regional stability efforts through legislative support. And we also need to help monitor the peace agreements and also build stronger ties with the other parliaments in the region. So I think that's something we need to lay as a foundation from our side. In March 2024, the UN Security Council extended the mandate of the Sudan Sanctions Committee's appeal of experts. They mandated the Sudan Sanctions Committee's panel of experts and tasked them with investigating, the funding sources of these warring parties. However, there's never been an update on this matter, unless I missed it somehow. But I believe it is crucial that these external interests are identified, and we need to be very intentional when it comes to it, because now it's just a compliance issue and talk shop happening around this issue. So I think we need to identify these external interests, particularly if we want to maintain diplomatic relations with them, because you will find a situation where we have relations with these funding parties. So we need to know that information because it will not only support the ongoing efforts of the AU and UN, but it will also enhance and inform our own diplomatic and parliamentary engagements from our side. So I also agree and support the call to revitalize the AU and IGAD, etc. And I think it starts with such reports, to revitalize those institutional bodies. So I think these mechanisms will remain key to facilitate, dialogue and the lasting peace we all want. So also, yeah. No, I think from my end, I think that's that, Chairperson. But I think it would be also appropriate if we would have the department part and parcel, of such engagements, not only our department, but going forward, I think we also have to have bilaterals with the presidency, just to ensure that we maintain our monitoring tasks of these agreements. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Kumbaka. Thank you. Honorable Zuma.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chair. Chair, we have far too many slogans in Africa, like silencing of the guns. Sudan today is in flames, torn by rival of the generals and being put apart by in the hands of the foreign powers. We've been told today that over 20 million Sudanese have been displaced, and majority of them being women and children. Darfur is bleeding again, and it's something that we should not be witnessing. South Sudan was birthed with such hope, which now sinks under authoritarian drift. And they're missing deadlines, and the jailing of opposition leaders doesn't assist their situation. And yet South Africa is silent. Like, what has South Africa done? The executives, they're always issuing statements, and I think we should all take blame for this. We should applaud the dialogue. We have not demanded any answers up to today. I don't know why, as a committee, we have not convened special parliamentary session on Sudan and South Sudan, despite the deepening crisis, like we did with the DRC Congo crisis. I think we must state it clear that this is not a technical issue; it's a moral failure on the people of Sudan. I must confront whether parliamentary diplomacy also has become merely ceremonial. We've become spectators, and our silence is becoming too loud. I think that we should assist as South Africa to maybe build or pave a road towards African-led peace building or democratic solidarity or something. And I think we should take maybe some lessons or knowledge or wisdom. In 2002, South Africa's then Deputy President Jacob Zuma became the main mediator in Burundi. This process there, when he took over from Utata Nelson Mandela, and he played a key role in helping the Burundian government and the main rebel group, the CNDD and FDD, reach a ceasefire. And that intervention helped to stabilize the nation, which was on the verge of collapse. And I mean to ask Mr. Ramaphosa that if he needs assistance, he must go and ask people that have done it and have done it well. I mean, Burundi still enjoys long-lasting peace up to this day. It may not be perfect, but there's been no war. So we need to learn how, when we're talking about we're going to assist the country, we must know actually how to do it. I think that South Africa has taken too much interest in America and Ukraine instead of focusing on continental issues. If we call ourselves Pan-Africanists, we need to focus on Africa because we need to know also as South Africa that Africa does look towards us for guidance, wisdom, and assistance because that's how great of a country we are. And I think that South Africa is letting the continent down. So I want to ask the questions to yourself, Chair, or to the presenter, on what are the measurable outcomes that DIRCO and the special envoy led by Mr. Mashatile, what can they present? What have they done? Can they show us that they've maybe saved lives, restored democracy, improved human rights? Number two, why has South Africa not used its seat in the African Union and even in the UN to demand mediation against the warlords that are sabotaging peace and the sovereignty of this nation? And maybe we should know that we're going to be judged. History is watching us and the people are listening. So we must remind ourselves that those who have watched Africa burn whilst we're here sitting and debating, it just doesn't make sense. We should be out there. We should act. We should encourage for African unity, African conviction, and everlasting peace. So I'm hoping that these engagements will maybe get to the presidency where they can actually take our concerns a bit seriously and find some peace in the conflict areas, especially within Africa. Outside of Sudan, there's the DRC and many of the mushrooming conflicts that are erupting in Africa. Thank you, Chair.
Honorable Member Zuma. Honorable Makubela, you are the last one, and we take this opportunity as the Portfolio Committee to congratulate you for your additional responsibility as the Chief Whip of the official opposition party here in Parliament, MKP. Thank you very much. You can make your input.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for the congratulatory note. I appreciate that. If you don't mind, I will just turn off my video and speak. I wanted to just say thank you, looking at you. Chairperson, my two colleagues from MK Party have already made very profound representations, Honorable Douglas and Honorable Zuma, in terms of how we as MK see this conflict and the underlying causes of this conflict. I think it's important, Chairperson, that we really revive the role of this portfolio committee so that we don't come here week in, week out, and we discuss these very important issues where there is serious humanitarian crisis, civil wars, where we can see clearly with evidence and reportings that external interferences leaving these countries fragmented and vulnerable. We've seen women, children, and men massacred in Sudan, South Sudan, and they were buried in the same graves. You know, it's really a humanitarian crisis. The political instability, the challenges that they've been facing there. And what concerns us the most is that we can clearly see that this Roman statutes and these Roman Dutch laws that keep being promoted and we are forced to abide and oblige by them, they have not worked to resolve any conflicts in Africa, even in South Africa. These Roman Dutch laws that we are not willing to open up and relook even our own constitution here in our country, has not assisted to redress the inequalities and the atrocities of the past. And if we don't, as South Africa, become exemplary in how we can dismantle these colonial structures, economic structures, colonial ways of them continuing to rape and take resources out of our country, plunder African countries, leave them in desolation. It's so sad to hear that whilst Coca-Cola is operating there, while minerals and oils are being siphoned out of Sudan, while the natives of that land are dying every day in thousands, that the West is at play, Egypt and other countries are at play, and nothing is being done. And our diplomacy, Chairperson, is not working for the African continent. If we're going to continue in this dialogue and the kind of diplomacy that we've approached all of these things, all of these conflicts and all of this unrest with, it means we will be sitting here in the next 20 years and 30 years still discussing the conflicts. I think there has to be a fundamental dismantling. And Honorable Dudu has correctly said there is a blueprint of how peace can be attained. And President Zuma did show us how to do that. Why are we not learning from the past? Now, if we don't approach these issues with the seriousness that it demands, and in recognition that the context and the complexities of the conflict, it lies in the colonial and the external interferences in the African way, African justice, African principles of inclusivity, sustainable development. And we have to, as this committee, find a way to assist AU in really trying to revitalize its efforts to help and to get to the core of what is it that can be done to relieve Sudan of this conflict that it has been facing for years. We are now, Chairperson, with SAF regaining the Khartoum in early 2025, RSF still entrenched in Darfur, we are witnessing now the potential de facto territorial split yet again. And how can we, as this committee in South Africa, working with AU, prevent the repeat of what happened in 2011 when South Sudan secession happened and it was even bloodier circumstances? What can we do now? If you look at the history and we listen to the presentation, since 1956, 20 coup attempts have happened in that region. How do we play an active role, preventative role as this country? And Chairperson, with all of this that has been presented to us, it's sad to really hear that South Africa has not really played a meaningful role in the relief process in terms of the suffering that is happening there. We have not participated meaningfully in assisting whether it's women or children that are displaced, in helping with food security or giving of any kind of support to the civilians there. And I want to urge that this committee becomes the forefront of some of the relief programs that needs to be taken to South Sudan. A lot of what I had here has been covered by my colleagues, but in terms of the practical solutions and how we can use this committee, how we can bring this to the AU and creating the dialogue that is required amongst us and the key players, the key role players. I just want to see quickly on my notes what I'm missing. A couple of questions that I had written here. So given the failure of the international efforts like the Jeddah Declaration, What specific measures can South Africa take to ensure the peace-building initiatives are impactful instead of the symbolic nature that we have approached things? I think my colleagues have also referred to that. How do we, as this committee in South Africa, intend to now address the external interference, such as what we've seen with Egypt, UAE, and other Saudi Arabia and other United States, the Western countries? How do we then counter these influences that are creating these complexities in the country and in that region? Now, my colleagues have spoken about South Africa's parliamentary diplomacy. We need alternative models that can yield better results. I couldn't agree more with that. What lessons, Chair, and maybe the presenter can also share with us, can we draw from our involvement thus far in South Sudan, and also in the arrest of Dr. Riek Machar and the challenges of implementing that revitalized agreement? What are we learning? Are we growing in our understanding of some of these issues that occur, and also the failure in some of these agreements? What are we changing in our approach as we learn from those lessons? I've spoken about the humanitarian engagements. Now, indeed, we need a civilian approach, a civilian representation in terms of creating a Sudanese-owned or Sudanese-led process that can be credible for the Sudanese people, because whatever process that AU takes or South Africa can take that lead, it has to include the civilians. They must buy into that, and not just to appease the generals and the warlords. What can be done to ensure that we are inclusive, especially in women's coalitions and even the exiled pro-democracy leaders who these generals, they continue to silence? What efforts are being done at this stage to be more inclusive in the approach to bring peace and stability in that region? And as I draw to close, Chair, I want to re-emphasize that as MK Party, we believe and we stand for Pan-African solidarity. We do not believe the Roman Dutch law is going to assist in bringing peace and stability in Africa, and certainly not in the conflicts that we also face here in South Africa. Whatever solutions that need to be brought to the fore must be rooted in Pan-Africanism, in our African way and African laws of economic justice, African ways of empowerment of local communities, local players. And parliamentary diplomacy alone, unfortunately, will not help, and we will never stop talking about neo-colonialism, neo-liberation that has not helped even in the advancement of ordinary South African. Therefore, it cannot help even in advancement of ordinary Africans who wants to rebuild their country. It's time that we allow Africans to take their own matters in their own hand, find their own solutions. We support and we foster that leaders like Ibrahim Traoré should multiply, and we hope Sudan can one day find a leader like that who will be progressive in the policies, of progressive in how he approaches the dismantling of colonialism, removing of external interferences, and that is the only solution to peace, prosperity, and stability in Africa, and most certainly it will work in South Sudan and in North Sudan as well. I thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Kialabuha. Honorable Makubela, thanks, honorable members, for those robust inputs that we have made in the meeting. The objective is not to cover everything in one meeting. In international relations, you will have the tangibles and intangibles. That's one embedded character of international politics. Advocate, I'm now giving over to you to respond to some of the issues here.
Africa, thank you, Nyabonga. Nkosi, thank you. Let me begin where we should end and where maybe we should not end. and maybe we should not stop talking about the African conflicts and the rule of law and governance and democratization of the space. And I will begin where Honorable Makubela ended. And I think that's where it is important that I share some of her comments, and I agree with him when he's raising the issue of what are the best practices that can be looked into in terms of revitalizing the peace agreement in Sudan. Both you look at the North Sudan and South Sudan. But I have already emphasized the issue of the parliament in South Sudan and North Sudan, that can be the starting point. And the issue of beyond the gift of the givers as humanitarian aid in South Africa is that element where we need to look at the African Renaissance Fund, that it should have been looked into as at some point we looked at our developmental aid agency in African conflicts. We should look into that aspect. And I do also agree with members of the committee that maybe we need to reboot and redefine parliamentary diplomacy in an African context, in an indigenous way, and in a Pan-African mode, and even solidarity. And also looking at the global context, because we should not always look Africa outside the global picture and the global context. And that's where I fully agree on the issue of solidarity that must be raised when there are challenges. And the question of the potential territorial split, what came to my mind was the issue of separation of borders, what was mentioned by both the last speaker and the first speaker, and the other speaker, I think Mhlongo, when he raised the issue of the Berlin Conference, that let's start from the beginning, from the source, the genesis of the conflict of Sudan, that it comes from the Berlin Conference, and the beneficiaries that came from Britain and from UK that we cannot ignore from the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty. And I think that's how it is important to look at those aspects. Decolonizing international law, it is very important in Roman Dutch law. And that's where I think in our response, we need to also look at an African-based constitutional mechanism that is also informed by parliamentary mechanism. Parliamentary supremacy was misused by the apartheid government, but they never understood it. But constitutional supremacy also and parliamentary supremacy can also find each other in dealing with the issues that have been raised on colonial dismantling in terms of economic resources in Africa, because those are the push and the pull factors of conflicts. But also what what Honorable Makubela raised on the peace treaties that are signed outside Africa, like your Jeddah that you mentioned of Saudi Arabia, it could not hold water because of the actors and people who were involved. And I think you are correct that we need to find ways of African ways of involving or invoking UN Resolution 1325 on the role of women in terms of peace mediation. And I will further add on the role of youth also in terms of peace mediation. The aspect that came after Honorable Makubela is Honorable Zuma, which I think is very important to say. 5 years down the line, we are talking of silencing the guns in 2030. And I think that's where also our focus in our national interest document should look into, our national development plan, of how we look at silencing guns even in our own backyards, including South Africa and even Sudan. And I think it is important what Honorable Zuma raised in terms of tapping into the former heads of state. And I think I have alluded it towards my closure to say we tap on the wisdom of the former heads of state in terms of not only consultation, but also becoming envoys, because that's what has been happening even at the AU and at SADC level. And I think bringing the best practice of Burundi, bringing the best practice that I mentioned, that former President Zuma played a role even in the comprehensive peace agreement of North Sudan and South Sudan. That peace agreements, they will always have some errors, potholes, the way they have been drafted, they will never satisfy everyone. And that's where the issue of monitoring comes very clear in terms of what then is the role of Parliament to monitor the peace treaties. Who inked those peace treaties? What comes in there? Who is involved in the drafting of the peace treaties? But also the issue that Honorable Zuma raised of the envoy. I think it is important, yes, indeed, for the envoy to share whenever they engage with the panel of the wise. Beyond engaging with the panel of the wise, it is important to share also the contribution that South Africa will make in terms of its national interest, but also the continental interest of democratizing the South Sudan as well as the North Sudan. And the question that you are raising of influencing the UN and the AU, it is very important also that we still find our membership fees that we are paying at UN and AU, that is a value, that we don't just pay our AU membership fees for nothing. We see value out of it. And that's where I fully agree with you that we need to look at the best practices. Honorable Kumbaka, I think you have raised an important issue, that of the role of parliamentary diplomacy. What came to my mind was the foresight, the oversight, and the undersight that you need to play on the peace agreements. Others are signed even at the Oliver Tambo building, the Tigray, Ethiopia. We should play oversight to say what's not holding, what is holding. And I think you are correct to look at the lack of UN mechanisms in dealing with the Sudan sanctions, the expert committee on sanctions. Sometimes the UN Security Council said on a monthly basis, they deal with Sudan. But I don't think they are fatigued to always deal with the issues of sanctions, to deal with issues of arms culture, the issues of ammunition, the arms embargo. Very important. And I think you are correct also to say the monitoring task of the members of the committee to also engage with the presidency also. It is important because it's always sharing of notes and sharing of parliamentary wisdom in terms of handling the crisis that we find in North Sudan and South Sudan. I think coming to Honorable Emalus, I have to be honest with you, it's not that I've ignored the question of the International Rome Statute. As you are aware, that South Africa were the drafters of the Rome Statute. We are not only signatories. I have extensively studied this part on my international law studies. And when I use the word calculable risk, I don't think I want to justify the moral values, the moral issues, and ignore the legal commitment of the country and the judgments that we have shared with which are very important. But the issue of why you raise the issues of the genocide of Darfur, which I agree with you, and we had our advocate Dumisa Nsebeza who was involved in that UN report. The process of looking at the role of South Africa at looking at the Rome Statutes and the impunity by that time of the AU, like I've emphasized, there were many errors that happened. But what happened is that we had our soldiers who were in Sudan, in Darfur also, who were threatened. And I think that is an open issue that we might not have allowed Bashir, but at the same time, we were held ransom also by how we also view the double jeopardy of ICC during that time, how it handled many cases. And I think that was the position of South Africa, even at some point wanted to pull out of the ICC. And some of us, we were very critical that we cannot pull out of the institution that we have established at its early stages, meaning we're part of the creation of the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So there is no way one can ignore what has happened in that aspect. But maybe concluding with your aspects of having an AU Sudan tribunal, I thought of also the transitional justice mechanism that might be needed, the issues of raising of being committed to the African human rights instruments and institutions. Fully agree. And I think you share the same sentiments of UN Resolution 1325, of new mediation efforts, but also bringing women in and also aiding the youth. And looking also at our past, I think you share the same sentiments with other members that, we have a history where we have managed many conflicts, whether it's the conflict in Burundi, whether it's a conflict in Sudan, in DRC, the inter-Congolese dialogue, the conflict in Eswatini, the conflict in Zimbabwe, and many conflicts that we see, but also emphasizing the issue of the Sudan desk that is there at DIRCO. Maybe is to activate it and say, as they share quarterly reports, also how do we engage with the public as you raise the issue of public diplomacy on these issues. So I think I will just wind up there, but not to feel that the issue that you have raised, that we might have ignored our constitutional and our international obligation. I felt that there were issues, but we could not have agreed that there were violations that were committed by former President Bashir. And South Africa by then was held ransom by both also to respect the AU as it has invited President Bashir to the AU summit, not to the South Africa summit, despite that we are a member state and we are signatory. And like I said to you, those are the calculable risks that signatories and drafters normally do. And we have seen it even in Europe and others who have also violated the ICC warrant of arrest. We might not have to mention Omar Bashir and many African leaders, but there are many European leaders who have also ignored it, including the USA. And I think when I move to Honorable Mhlongo, I fully share the sentiments that you have raised in terms of, and that's where what came to my mind of our influence, that former President Thabo Mbeki was involved in the high-level panel on Sudan. And this panel was so important that it even produced the report to understand the push and the pull factors. And I hope I will share that report with the members of the committee. It's not a long document, 48 pages. And I think it will assist the members of the committee to also grasp and grapple with the issues that how South Africa has influenced both the AU and the UN by employing its former head of state, but also employing its members of the committee of former foreign affairs members who were involved in assisting President Mbeki to be in this high-level panel. But you have raised an important issue, I think, also of the state building, which I think we should not ignore. And you have also raised the issue of the AU theme of access to justice. And what struck me was the reparation agenda. When will be the reparation for the people of Sudan, both the North and the South? Those are the questions that have to be posed as member states goes to the AU summit to raise the question of Sudan and the issue of ending the conflict that is in Sudan. The state formation building and state building, it reminded me of Anthony Mzwakele Mbede when he has to define African democracy. And also the concepts of decolonization, recolonization, and colonization. And we cannot run away from that. Most member states, most MPs here, they use the word African solution to African problems, which have a problem with that concept. But are they not European-made, man-made problems that create now the African solutions, that we must find African solutions? Because Africans never created their own problems, but they are European-created. And that's where the issue that we have raised of the role of solidarity, Honorable Mhlongo, was very important. And also sharing your sentiments with the chairperson when you raised the Berlin conference impact, that the Berlin conference impact, as many people will want us to forget it, but it was also it was the miscarriage of international law, how lawyers were used, how diplomats were used, technocrats, legal minds, to work around the Berlin conference. And at the same time, when you look at many conflicts that you find, whether DRC or Sudan, it finds itself linked to the Berlin conference impact and the role that we have raised of the Anglo-Egyptian relation in both the North and the South Sudan. Honorable Wesley, I think you are correct to raise one issue that I feel that many members, I might have skipped it, of economic diplomacy and situation, that the Red Sea trade route pushes us to say, but where is Africa continental free trade in this global traffic of tariffs? Where is the Africa continental free trade, which was partly disrupted by COVID-19, where we could have taken opportunity? The Port of Sudan, it is a mirage of many international multinationals who have an interest. And that's where also the impact rises about the Red Sea trade route that you have mentioned. You have raised an important issue that we might not talk about the genocide that is going on in Sudan for many years. But we find the Darfur genocide, the UN find ways of saying, but there must be charges of those who committed the genocide in Darfur. You have also raised an important issue of what has the AU done? I think I've raised it on my presentation that the the new AU chairperson has engaged to say he would want to engage Sudan. And that's how the matter of Sudan is back. Also at the AU desk. It's also back at the Africa Standby Force when you talk about the military approach and intervention. It is back the issue of standby force in Sudan. So the question that I've said before of what then is the role of United Arab Emirates and Egypt? It could also be looked as the mechanism of looking with the Arab Parliament. When our parliamentarians, as a member of parliament, you engage with other parliaments, the Arab League Parliament or the Arab League, or what we'll call the Arab parliamentarians, how do you engage with them on this role of their members in the conflict in Sudan? It will be very important. And fully agree with the issue of public consultation and engaging with the Sudanese when these issues arise so that we are able to feel and hear their plight. As I'm engaging with the members of parliament, I have already engaged with some of the members of Sudan community, both in the north and in the south, who are trapped by this conflict. So it is important what you are raising to always capture the voice of those who are affected by this conflict. And also the issue of the travel bans that we have raised on targeted sanctions. The main issue is that let the travel be internal for national peace dialogues to raise the peace bar, rather than for them to go to Europe and sign the peace treaties in Europe. Rather, let them spend more time in their villages building that peace, that spirit, and the peace in the minds of their communities. And that's where it will cover the aspect of silencing the guns, but silencing the minds also that are in the minds of the people who are in Sudan. Finally, as I close, Chair, I think you have raised also a mouthful in terms of capturing the issue of natural resources. How do we govern it in the continent? And I think it's the theme of the AU peer review mechanism and the Peace and Security Council this year. The governance report of 2025 of the AU is looking at the natural resources as the drivers of conflicts in Africa. And what you have alluded is also the issue of ownership, the role of the state vis-a-vis the role of the private sector and the multinationals. Where is that trade route that was raised earlier? And the strategic trade being Africa Continental Free Trade, and also the regional economic bodies, which we'll call SADC, ECOWAS. Where do we find our sense there? You also raise an important issue of the former colonizers. I think the AU theme allows you, Chair, to raise the issues of the negative forces, what I call conflict entrepreneurs, the conflict drivers in African conflicts, the hidden faces and hands in African conflicts. Under 8-4 development, while it's 8-4 conflict. Now, the AU standby force has been revived, Chair. There are issues around the AU standby force on Sudan, how to handle the crisis in Sudan. And that's where the issues of also engaging with other parliamentary portfolio committees on sharing notes, the Joint Standing Committee on Defense, you'll be able to be on par to know where is the standby force of the AU on Sudan. And finally, I think when you raise the issue of democracy and how do we look at Sahel and ECOWAS, and the issues that I looked at the African Charter on Democracy, Election and Governance, that also South Africa being the drafters and the drivers of it in 2010 until it was ratified in 2012. I think we've been very clear about unconstitutional changes of government. But when we look at the Sahel and the issues around the former colonizers and the military generals who have emerged at this stage, there are many conflicting messages about whether those military coups are military revolutions, and also is it what you have raised, Chair, about neocolonialism, as Nkrumah will have said, is the last stage of imperialism. And that's how we see France found itself wanting in Mali in Burkina Faso, in Niger, and it goes to your first issue of natural resources. But the military coups within the AU also, there's a need to revive that debate around the military coups in Africa. How do we redefine them? How we look at the role of regional economic bodies? Because whatever happens in the Sahel has a direct impact that might happen in the SADC region, in North Africa, in East Africa. We must not look at the Sahel military coups just as military coups, but it must also send a signal. I think I will pause there, Chair. But the one of identity that you raised, I will say Agenda 2063 becomes our pillar in terms of our cultural identity. And the Africa we want is of Africa without borders. Quite difficult how we move there, but the common identity aspect is the issue that we need to use. What I'll always say in diplomacy is a soft power, cultural diplomacy. And people like Miriam Makeba comes to my mind when you think of cultural diplomacy, and she was able eloquently to represent South Africa, both at the UN and at the OAU level. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Advocate Kialaboha. Thank you very much for that comprehensive response to the critical issues that were raised by the honorable members. Lubabalo, I'm sure you and your team, there are many recommendations. There are over 30. I hope you have captured those recommendations. And I think one of the things we may have to try introduce and sustain in the committee is a follow-up on our own resolutions that we take here as a committee, so that we can make progress. The Arabs, some of them are here, honorable members. So I spoke to some of them yesterday. We are continuing a bit of a discussion today, trying to ensure that as a committee at some point, we may have to sit down with them on a committee to committee, full committee basis. We are hamstrung in Parliament by the bureaucracy of applications that we have to go through when we want to engage as the portfolio committee. So I will say that struggle continues. So we'll give feedback on some of the engagements which are taking place here. Advocate, in future, we are going to definitely ensure that you come back to the committee to engage on critical issues that are geopolitical, but also with special focus on the African continent. I want to thank the staff for having prepared for the smooth transmission of our meeting today. The platforms that were provided, we'll check them, Honorable Powell, for South Africans to access the discussions in our committee. We want to thank those who are coming from DERCO, who are following up the proceedings of the committee today, and for your contributions, honorable members, that you made here today. In Brazil now, it's 6:30 in the morning. So immediately here, it means one did not sleep from 3 o'clock, having to log into this particular meeting, but the struggle continues. We will meet next week in Parliament when one comes back. Thanks for everybody, and Advocate, thank you very much. Enjoy your day.
Thank you, Chairperson, and to the
Thank you,
members.
Chairperson. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Bye.
Thank you, Chair.